This is an account of an American soldier in Vietnam, retold for you. He wanted to drop out of high school, but his best friend threw him up against a wall to knock some sense into him, that he's throwing his life away. So he stayed with it and graduated. Later, he was very glad that he did. After high school, he worked and lived in a funeral home and had different jobs. He once attended a political rally for LBJ, who gave him his coat to hold while he gave a speech. Years later, he would find it ironic that President Johnson would send him to war. I guess no good deed goes unpunished. In the early 60s, he went a year or two to college. In 1966, he dropped out so he could afford to buy a car. Dropping out back then meant that you were suddenly eligible for the draft. And of course, he got drafted into the Marines and had to sell the car. He also found this ironic. When he reported to the building where Marine draftees mustered, the Army desks were there too. He walked up and asked a Marine sergeant where he should go and what he should do. While doing this, he put on his glasses to read the draft document. The Marine sergeant looked at him and emphatically stated, "Marines don't wear glasses." The Marine sergeant said, "Scratch Marines off the top of the draft document and go over to the Army desk." When he got to the Army desk, they asked what he did in civilian life, and he said that he drove a delivery truck. Well, the Army always needs truck drivers, so after basic training, he was sent to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for advanced individual training at the Army's truck driving school. By chance, almost 3 decades later, his son would also go to the same Army post for basic training. Once he was in country, he was assigned to a truck route in central South Vietnam. He drove from Qui Nhon on the coast to Pleiku near Cambodia and back. He ran this route with little variation from 1966 to 67. At this point in the Vietnam War, it was relatively safe to be in the rear with the gear. This was before the Tet Offensive, which happened 2 to 3 years later. On his time off, he could go to the local town without much fear, which changed a few years later. At some point, he took a week off to go to Bangkok, Thailand. Later, he was offered another week off for R&R in Bangkok, and the rule was that you only got to go once a year. But from a misunderstanding or misfiled paperwork, he was offered that second chance, so he took it. He usually slept in his truck after completing his run. He kept a rifle in the truck. He was tall and skinny, so much so that his son was able to wear his uniform to an 8th grade costume party. When he came back from Vietnam, he was even skinnier than when he left. He said that they used to aim their communications equipment at the moon in order to bounce back to the United States to call home. He watched the Vietnamese fishermen put their fish on the beach to dry in the sand and sun. Of course, bugs would crawl all over them, but it didn't bother the locals, who ate them up. This left him with a lifelong disgust of certain Asian cooking, even some of the Americanized versions. There was a tank on a hill far away, and it fired off a round, and he said it was really loud, way louder than Hollywood made it out to be. He used to heat up his sea rations under the hood of the truck. Once he forgot about it and was driving along and bang! The can busted inside the hood. It probably scared him because it probably sounded like a gunshot. The roads in the back country of Vietnam at that time were narrow and sometimes had thick forest around them. So no one, not even a Jeep, could pass. Army drivers weren't supposed to drive too fast, but some did anyway. He told a story about how some MPs in a Jeep were chasing another driver in a deuce and a half, and they had the lights flashing and the deuce and a half wouldn't stop for them because the driver knew he was in trouble. So the driver floored it and made it back to the base faster than the MPs could and hid amongst the other soldiers. Although it's hard to believe, he said that the deuce and a half could outrun a Jeep in the backcountry. He also fell asleep behind the wheel while driving at least once, but because the ruts in the road and the forest on both sides, the truck was still going strong when he woke up. On another occasion, a fellow truck driver stopped out in the middle of nowhere, pulled out an M14 and shot off a few magazines of 7.62 millimeter on full automatic, just for fun. The M14 was the automatic version and the successor of the M1, the popular rifle in World War II and Korea. A few years later, the M16 would replace it in Vietnam. The MPs came roaring up in a jeep, looking around, and asked who shot off the rounds, which he found funny. Another time, he was driving along and didn't realize that he had gone behind enemy lines and was all alone. As stated before, the roads were narrow dirt roads with forest on both sides. He saw or heard Vietnamese in the bush, which he guessed were Viet Cong, so he backed up that deuce and a half at full speed, not taking any chances. Generally, they drove in convoys of a few trucks, but sometimes they got separated. Some of the Vietnamese children would jump on the back of the truck while it was still moving to see if there were things to steal. Truck drivers had to watch out for this a lot. He was never wounded. He served a year and then rotated back stateside with another year and a half or so with service in the Individual Ready Reserve, which is where you are still available to be called up in a national emergency, but generally you are considered out of the Army. Years later, he kept his Army hat in the closet, and his toddler son used to put it on and walk around with a red toy hammer. There were probably things that he saw and did that he didn't talk about, like many Vietnam veterans. His commanding officer thought highly of him and offered to send him to officer candidate school because he had some college, but he turned it down because he wanted to return to civilian life. Later in life, he loved wearing his Vietnam veteran hat and being recognized as a veteran. His only son also followed in his footsteps many years later, and volunteered and served in the Army for 5 years. He loved watching football, pro and college, and died of a respiratory problem a few days before the Super Bowl in 2018. He wasn't a perfect person, but he was loved. That Vietnam veteran was my dad.